No one in that quiet street imagined that a billionaire who could buy anything would be walking with his shoulders shaking, as if the world had suddenly become too heavy to hold. That is the first thing that made the scene feel wrong. The way Calvin looked like someone who did not belong anywhere, especially not like someone whose name carried power. And yet, there he was, moving in a slow and lost way, right after hearing the final words from the doctor, who told him that Dr. Vernon Hale had passed. The title of this story, Where a Billionaire Orders the Cheapest Meal and is Shocked by Kindness, begins here, in the moment he pushes through the hospital doors and feels the cold outside air hit his face so sharply it almost takes his breath away. It is not the kind of cold that comes from weather, but the kind that comes when the only steady point in a life disappears. Calvin tries to breathe normally, tries to hold himself together, but his chest keeps tightening and his thoughts keep slipping away like sand in his hands. He keeps walking without knowing where his feet take him, only that he wants to get away from the smell of disinfectant and the echo of machines that mean nothing now. His wealth, normally a shield, feels useless, almost embarrassing, because there is no check he can sign that brings someone back. When he finally notices the glow of a small diner's neon sign, he steps inside in the same way a tired traveler seeks a shelter. And that is where the first curiosity rises, because the way he slumps into the booth, the way his eyes look empty, would make anyone wonder who this man really is, and what kind of secret he is carrying that could break someone who is supposed to be unbreakable. Calvin sits down like someone who is trying not to fall apart in public, and for a moment he just stares at the table's surface, as if it could offer some answer he lost along the way. When the waitress comes to take his order, he asks for the cheapest thing on the menu, not because he is thinking about money, but because he knows he will not be able to swallow more than a bite. The choice seems odd coming from a man dressed in clothes that cost more than the diner's monthly rent, but no one inside knows who he is or what kind of day he has had. Tessa Crowley, the manager, notices him from behind the counter and watches with suspicion because she has seen enough people come in looking strange, but there is something different about him she cannot quite place. Mara Ellington, on the other hand, stops for a moment when she sets the menu down, seeing how red his eyes are and how tightly he holds his hands under the table. She senses something broken about him, something that reminds her of nights she has spent comforting people she cared about. The food arrives, but Calvin does not touch it. He sits in silence, staring forward like someone trying to remember how life felt before the ground opened beneath his feet. The contrast between his expensive shoes and the cheap plate in front of him creates an image that lingers in the mind, making anyone wonder what emptiness could drive a man like that into this small place. Mara feels that pull too, and even though customers are waiting and Tessa wants her moving tables faster, she hesitates, unable to walk away from a sadness that seems too heavy for one person to carry. During her short break, Mara returns to his booth with a soft voice, the kind used when speaking to someone who looks like they might break at the slightest push. She asks if he wants the meal wrapped, not because she is trying to offer a service, but because she cannot think of another way to reach him gently. Calvin looks up, and the moment his eyes meet hers, she sees hands trembling, not from cold, but from everything he is holding inside. Something changes in her. Instead of stepping back like logic tells her to, she slides into the booth across from him, just for a moment, just to give him a space where he does not have to pretend. Calvin is not used to genuine concern. He is used to assistants who obey him, investors who admire him, and people who want something from him. But Mara does not ask anything. She simply listens to the silence between them, which strangely feels louder than speaking. For the first time in months, Calvin feels his chest soften, as if someone had touched a part of him he had forgotten was still alive. This is the beginning of the inciting incident, the moment when Mara's small kindness disrupts the emotional wall he built to protect himself from the world. He does not know why he finds himself wanting to speak, or why this stranger's presence feels safer than any boardroom full of people he trusts with millions. And that is where the pull of the story grows stronger, because it makes one wonder what he will reveal to her, and why this quiet diner becomes the place where a man who always carries secrets feels ready to uncover one of them. Mara, seeing that silence has opened a door, decides to share a small piece of her own story, mentioning a loss she suffered years ago and how the world felt too loud for her to think straight afterward. She does not go into detail, and she does not pretend to understand his pain fully, but the honesty in her voice reaches him in a way nothing has in a long time. Calvin feels something stirring inside, a memory of Dr. Hale telling him that people without power often offer the most sincere help because they understand pain in a quieter and deeper way. He feels strangely comforted and at the same time exposed, like someone has found the crack he tried to hide from everyone. The diner sounds fade into the background, replaced by memories of Vernon's steady voice and the lessons about humanity he insisted Calvin never forget. Pressure builds inside him, not the kind that comes from business deals or expectations, but the kind that forces a person to face the truth they have tried to avoid. It becomes harder for Calvin to keep pretending he is fine, harder to act like this moment means nothing. Something feels unsustainable, as if the weight he has been carrying refuses to stay hidden any longer. The question rises naturally: what exactly is being awakened inside him, and why does a simple waitress's compassion shake a man who is used to commanding entire markets? Calvin finally speaks in a low tone, telling Mara about Vernon Hale, the man who believed that wealth meant nothing if it stopped someone from understanding the people around them. He remembers how Vernon once told him to pay attention to those who sit with him when he is hurting, because that is when real character shows itself. As the words leave his mouth, Calvin realizes Mara's presence is exactly what Vernon was talking about. It hits him harder than he expects. For a moment he feels a fragile calm settle over his chest, a feeling he has not felt since before Vernon fell ill. When he stands to leave, he knows he is not the same man who walked into the diner. Something has shifted, something he cannot ignore. Mara does not realize it, but her simple act of sitting with him has become a seed of change, a spark that pushes him toward a path he has avoided for too long. As he steps back into the cold air outside, he carries a new question that refuses to stay quiet inside his mind. How can he honor Vernon in a way that truly reflects what the man taught him about people and kindness? And that is where the pull into the next part of the story becomes impossible to resist, because whatever he does next will shape everything that follows. Before we go on, take a second and pause the video to tell me in the comments where you're watching from and whether you've ever met someone whose kindness stayed in your mind for days. Go ahead and do that now, because it helps this story reach even more people, and once you comment, we'll continue right from where Calvin's heart started to shift. Calvin returned to his penthouse, the way someone returns to a place that no longer feels like home, carrying in his chest the weight of that small moment in the diner that simply refused to fade. He set his coat aside without thinking, moving through the wide living room like the lights were too bright and the silence too loud. Jerome noticed it instantly, the way Calvin didn't say a single word from the elevator to the door, and instead of asking direct questions, he just lingered nearby, giving the quiet kind of company he knew Calvin sometimes needed. Calvin lowered himself into a chair and rubbed his eyes, replaying the image of Mara sitting across from him, not for money, not for praise, but because she actually cared. That simple act made his chest twist, stirring memories he had tried to bury after Vernon passed. When his phone buzzed, he almost ignored it, until he saw a saved voicemail from Vernon that he hadn't listened to in months. The sound of his mentor's voice cracked something open inside him as Vernon spoke about looking for people who weren't chasing him for what he had, but for who he was beneath it all. Calvin felt his throat tighten because those words fit too perfectly with what he saw in that diner, and suddenly Mara became more than a stranger. She became a reminder of the part of himself he lost on the way to becoming someone everyone respected, but few actually knew. He got up and walked toward the window, staring at the city below like it might help him organize the thoughts bouncing in his mind. His chest filled with a restless feeling, a mix of longing and confusion, like he was supposed to do something but didn't yet understand what it was. He whispered Vernon's name once and closed the message, feeling the pressure building behind the grief until it turned into a different kind of ache, the kind that pushes a man forward instead of holding him down. Jerome approached slowly and asked if he needed anything, but Calvin only shook his head, still lost in the idea of how small kindness could cut deeper than speeches, money, or grand gestures. It made him realize that the tribute he originally planned for Vernon felt too cold, too formal, too distant from the humanity Vernon had always tried to teach him. That thought grew heavier by the second, until it became clear that a normal memorial would never honor the man who shaped him. Something inside him shifted again, clearer this time, almost like a decision forming without his permission. Vernon deserved more, something alive, something that reflected the heart he carried even when the world saw only brilliance. Calvin exhaled slowly, coming to terms with it, and the question that rose inside him felt like the start of something that could change everything. If Mara represented the values Vernon lived by, then maybe she was the key to honoring him properly. But what exactly did that mean, and how far was Calvin willing to go to follow that instinct? Calvin woke up the next morning with the same feeling he carried home, that restless tug he could not ignore, so he went back to the diner without announcing who he was or why he had returned. He chose a table in the corner where he could watch without being noticed, pulling the hood of his jacket a little lower, hoping the quieter look would help him blend in. Mara was already moving between tables, carrying plates with a soft smile that never felt forced, greeting people like she actually remembered their stories from the day before. He watched her refill a cup for an older man before he even had to ask, checked on a young mother trying to calm her baby, and spoke kindly to a teenager who looked scared to order alone. Every gesture was small, almost invisible to someone not paying attention, but to Calvin it was like watching a rare kind of honesty he barely saw in the world he lived in. He noticed Tessa standing by the register, giving Mara the kind of look that carried silent pressure, and when Mara came close enough, Tessa whispered something sharp that made Mara's shoulders stiffen. Mara still walked to the next table with calm eyes, refusing to push bigger meals or make people buy more than they needed. It struck Calvin how natural it was for her to protect the dignity of strangers when she gained nothing from it. That sincerity made his chest warm in a way that almost startled him, because it echoed Vernon's voice so clearly that he had to blink a few times to steady himself. When Mara paused for a second to help a customer who seemed embarrassed about having only enough money for a simple bowl of soup, Calvin heard her say softly that kindness was worth more than anything on the menu, and her tone carried a truth that went deeper than the words themselves. That single moment made Calvin sit back and breathe slower, the quiet awe washing over him like a soft wave. Moments like this make people think about times when someone's small kindness changed a day, or even a life, and many who listen to stories like this remember things they don't talk about often. It helps to know others feel that too. Like all of us are here, noticing how rare genuine care has become, and how powerful it feels when it shows up in simple places. Calvin felt something shift inside him again as he watched Mara choose people over profit, compassion over pressure, and truth over convenience. Her choices felt like a mirror of the lessons Vernon had tried to build in him for years, and for a second, he wondered if he had ever lived up to any of them. That thought stung, but it also pushed him forward, nudging him toward an understanding he had not been ready to face before. When Mara stopped by his table without realizing who he was, just to ask if he needed anything, her voice held the same honest warmth she gave everyone else, and Calvin felt a strange mix of gratitude and guilt. He wanted to say something, but the words froze, because he wasn't sure whether revealing himself would make the moment real or ruin the quiet truth he was witnessing. He watched her walk away again, the decision pressing on him from inside, heavy and alive. He understood then why Vernon always said integrity was something you recognized instantly, even if you weren't ready to admit it, and now he saw it so clearly that it left him wondering if he should step forward or stay hidden a little longer, until he understood what this feeling was supposed to become. Calvin spent the next morning sitting at the long table in his office, while sunlight spilled across papers he had not planned to deal with so soon, but something inside him kept pushing him forward. The images of Mara helping strangers with quiet patience replayed in his mind, mixing with Vernon's old lessons about lifting people who carried goodness in them, even when the world overlooked them. His legal team waited with pens ready, watching him with the kind of curiosity that came when Calvin moved with a determination they could not predict. He explained that he wanted to create a scholarship fund in Vernon Hale's name, not a simple memorial, but something alive, something that carried the spirit of compassion Vernon lived by. The lawyers asked for details, expecting he would choose a board of executives or respected public figures to represent the project, but Calvin surprised them by saying he already had someone in mind. When they asked who, he hesitated for a second, feeling his chest tighten with the fear of being misunderstood. Then he said Mara Ellington's name, and he saw confusion flash across their faces, followed by concern. They reminded him gently that he barely knew her, that picking someone outside of his circle could be seen as careless, that people might question his judgment at a time when he was grieving. But Calvin was tired of decisions built on image instead of meaning. He said Vernon would want someone who lived their values, not someone who performed them. His voice softened when he described what he witnessed in the diner, how Mara gave without expecting anything, how she treated strangers with more respect than people in his world treated their own partners. The room fell quiet, and for a moment Calvin wondered if he had said too much, if revealing that vulnerable part of himself would make them doubt his stability. But he felt deep down that this was the first decision in a long time that actually felt like his. The lawyers exchanged looks, but eventually agreed to move forward, drafting the documents while Calvin leaned back and let the tension roll through him like a wave. He thought about Mara's kindness and how it had pulled him out of that dark space inside him, not because she knew who he was, but because she saw a hurting man and acted. That thought kept growing in him until it felt like a calling rather than an idea. Decisions like this have a way of circling back later, reshaping everything that follows, and even if Calvin couldn't see the full path yet, something inside him already knew this choice would open doors he wasn't expecting. He asked Jerome to arrange a car, giving him the diner's address and telling him to pick Mara up after her shift, but not to explain anything yet. Jerome raised an eyebrow, quietly making sure Calvin understood how strange it might feel for her to be approached by a stranger with a luxury car. Calvin nodded, admitting he didn't know how she would react, and that uncertainty made his stomach tighten. Still, the decision felt right, almost necessary, like the next page of a story he didn't know he had been writing. He stood by the window, staring at the city again, but this time with a clearer sense of direction. He could feel that things were moving forward, that the connection formed in that small diner was no accident, and that Vernon's lessons were finally taking root in ways he had ignored for too long. Yet under that progress lingered a quiet question he could not answer, a question that tugged softly at the edge of everything he was planning. Would Mara trust the invitation of a man she barely knew, or would this gesture open a new conflict he hadn't considered? Mara had just finished wiping down a table when she heard someone calling her name from outside, a voice she didn't recognize, and when she stepped through the diner's door, she froze at the sight of a sleek black car parked at the curb with Jerome standing beside it. Her first reaction was pure panic, a sharp fear that this had to be a mistake or some kind of mix-up that would embarrass her in front of everyone. She shook her head, insisting she hadn't ordered a ride, hadn't signed up for anything, hadn't done anything that would call for a stranger showing up in a car that clearly didn't belong in her part of town. Jerome approached with a calm smile, hands visible, speaking gently so she wouldn't feel trapped. He explained that someone wanted to speak with her, someone she had already met, and the moment he said that her heart began to race because she knew only one person fit that description, yet she couldn't imagine why he would send a car for her. She took a step back, unsure, but Jerome added that she could say no at any moment, that it was her choice, that nothing would happen without her being comfortable. That softened the fear just enough for her to breathe. She hesitated again, touching her apron like she needed something to hold on to, then nodded slowly with a seriousness that surprised even herself. Inside the car, the soft leather seats felt too expensive beneath her, and the faint scent of cedar reminded her that she was far from her usual world. She kept her hands in her lap and watched the streets pass by with growing tension twisting in her stomach. Jerome, sensing her discomfort, began speaking without forcing a conversation. He told her that Calvin was a man who carried more pain than he allowed anyone to see, that her kindness had reached him at a moment when he truly needed someone who wasn't expecting anything from him. Mara blinked, taken aback by the idea that her small gesture had affected him in any meaningful way. She remembered his trembling hands, his distant look, the way sadness had clung to him like a shadow. She confessed to Jerome that she still didn't understand why she was being brought anywhere, that she wasn't special, that she only did what anyone with a heart would do. Jerome shook his head softly, saying most people don't take the time to sit with someone who looks broken, and that Calvin hadn't forgotten that moment. His words settled over her like something warm and heavy, making her look out the window again with a mix of fear and curiosity wrapping around her thoughts. As they approached Calvin's building, the sight alone made Mara's breath hitch. It towered over the city with clean lines and bright windows, nothing like the places she usually walked into. Her chest tightened again as the elevator carried them upward, the soft hum filling the silence as she tried to prepare herself for whatever waited behind the doors. A memory of Calvin's strained voice from the diner flashed through her mind, the way he had spoken about his mentor, and suddenly she understood this wasn't about business or anything professional. This was something personal, something tied to grief she didn't fully understand yet. The elevator opened, and the quiet of his penthouse hallway washed over her. a kind of heavy stillness that told her she was stepping into someone's private world. Jerome gave her one reassuring nod before leading her toward an open doorway. When she crossed the threshold, her steps slowed on instinct. The room was filled with framed photos, handwritten notes, books with worn edges, and personal items arranged with a care that made the entire space feel like a heartbeat suspended in time. It wasn't a living room, and it wasn't an office. It was a memorial, quiet and intimate, a sanctuary built for someone who had shaped Calvin's life deeply. Mara felt the air shift inside her chest, something tender rising, as she realized she had walked into a place meant only for people who mattered. She sensed Calvin nearby before she saw him, the air carrying the kind of presence someone carries when they're remembering a person they loved. Mara stood still, the weight of the moment settling on her shoulders as she realized how much trust it took for him to bring her here. And the question that rose inside her was simple, but powerful. What truth was he about to share that needed this kind of silence around it? Mara stood in the center of the room, feeling the air shift around her as Calvin stepped forward, with a softness she hadn't seen in him before. He looked at the pictures and letters spread across the memorial space, his eyes tracing the pieces of Vernon's life that still felt alive in the things he left behind. Then he turned toward her with a kind of gratitude that came from somewhere deep, something shaped by memories that still carried warmth and pain together. He told her that when she sat with him in the diner, she gave him something he hadn't felt since Vernon was alive, something simple but powerful, a reminder that real compassion is quiet and doesn't ask for attention. Mara listened with her hands clasped together, unsure what to do with the weight of his words. He explained how Vernon spent years teaching him that kindness was a gift people gave without expecting anything back, and for the first time since Vernon's passing, he felt that lesson return to him through her. Mara blinked slowly, trying to steady her breath because she hadn't known her presence meant anything beyond helping a stranger through a hard moment. Calvin moved closer to one of the tables and picked up a small folder with documents inside, handing it to her with a careful touch. He explained that he was creating a scholarship fund in Vernon's honor, one meant to help people who carried the same heart Vernon spent years trying to nurture in him. Mara opened the folder, expecting to see forms or instructions, but instead she found her own name printed clearly near the top. She froze, her eyes scanning the words again and again until their meaning sank in. Calvin told her that he wanted her to be the first ambassador for the scholarship, someone who represented everything Vernon believed in. Mara's lips trembled as she tried to form a sentence, but nothing came out. She shook her head, overwhelmed, insisting that she was just a waitress, that she didn't deserve anything like this, that he hardly knew her. Calvin stepped closer and said quietly that sometimes you don't need to know someone for long to recognize the truth they carry. He added that Vernon used to remind him that the world changes not through grand speeches, but through the small acts someone chooses when no one is watching. Mara's breath finally broke, and tears rolled down her cheeks, soft and steady. She lowered her face into her hands for a moment, not from shame, but from a sense of something too big to hold all at once. Calvin reached for a tissue box without making a big gesture, placing it next to her with a respectful distance that let her have space to feel what she needed. She looked up slowly, eyes red, saying she didn't know if she could live up to something so meaningful, and Calvin admitted gently that he didn't know if he could either. That honesty made something settle between them, a bridge built from recognition rather than obligation. Mara took a shaky breath, letting the realization sink in that her small moment of kindness had become the root of something far larger than she ever imagined. She wiped her face and glanced again at Vernon's photos, feeling as if she had stepped into a story that began long before she ever entered it. Calvin watched her with a soft pride, but beneath it something still stirred in him, something unresolved and heavy, a guilt that refused to let go no matter how much gratitude filled the room. Mara sensed it in the way his shoulders tightened, in the quiet breaks between his sentences, but she didn't press him. Instead, she rested her hand briefly on one of the framed pictures of Vernon, whispering that he must have been a special man to leave such a mark. Calvin nodded, swallowing hard, because even as this moment came together beautifully, another part of him feared he had failed his mentor in ways Mara had not yet seen. That fear flickered in the background, hinting that what lay ahead would demand more honesty than he had ever spoken out loud. Moments like this make people wonder what they themselves would do if a single act of kindness changed someone's life so deeply. and it's the kind of moment that sparks conversation. If you're feeling something from this part of the story, share what you think in the comments and don't forget to subscribe so you can follow the rest of this journey as it unfolds. He gave Mara one last gentle look, grateful but carrying a shadow behind his eyes, and in that quiet exchange the air seemed to shift again, signaling that although something had healed here, something else still waited, something that would soon rise to the surface and change everything that came next. Calvin stayed in the quiet room long after Mara stepped out, the soft light from the shaded lamps spreading across Vernon's things like a memory that refused to fade. The scholarship papers still lay open on the table, and even though Mara's tears had shown him how deeply the gesture touched her, something inside him tightened again the moment the door clicked shut. He walked slowly to a small wooden box that Vernon used to keep letters and personal notes, tracing the edges like he used to when the man was still alive. The silence pressed against him until it felt hard to breathe, and when he lifted one of the letters, the weight of his mentor's handwriting pulled him down with a force he had been avoiding. He felt his throat close, and before he could steady himself, a raw sob worked its way out of him, deep and sharp, the kind that feels like the body is trying to empty what the heart cannot hold. He sank to his knees, clutching Vernon's letter to his chest, whispering how sorry he was, how he should have done more, how he failed in ways Vernon never knew. The guilt poured out like a tide that had waited too long, rising higher until it swallowed every thought. He told the room that the scholarship might be the wrong way to honor him, that maybe it was only a way to ease his own conscience. The words trembled in the air, shaking with fear that he had built something too big on something too small, that Mara deserved better than being dragged into his attempt to repair what he broke inside himself. The ache grew larger the longer he spoke, and he curled forward slightly, feeling like a man who had lost the last solid piece of his world. Mara returned silently after a few minutes, not to intrude, but because something in her heart told her to check on him. She froze when she saw him on the floor, his shoulders shaking and his face hidden in his hands. She didn't speak right away, letting her presence settle the way she had in the diner, letting him feel he wasn't alone without taking anything away from him. When she finally kneeled beside him, she kept a soft distance and placed one hand on the floor so he could sense her but not feel cornered. She whispered his name, gentle and steady, reminding him she was still there. Calvin tried to wipe his face, embarrassed by the rawness she walked in on, but his hands kept trembling. Mara shook her head lightly and told him he didn't owe her strength. Not here, not in this room built from love and loss. She glanced at Vernon's photos and said that men like him never expect perfection, only sincerity, and that if Calvin felt lost, it was only because he cared deeply, not because he failed. Her voice softened when she added that Vernon would be proud of the way Calvin was trying to honor him, and even prouder that a single act of kindness from a stranger had touched him enough to spark this change. Calvin pressed his lips together, fighting the shaking in his chest, asking her how she could believe this when she barely knew Vernon. Mara answered that she could see the man through the impact he left behind, through the way Calvin spoke his name, and through the way she herself now carried a piece of his legacy without ever meeting him. That thought made Calvin's tears slow as he listened, breathing unevenly, but no longer collapsing. She stayed with him in silence for a long moment, letting the stillness hold the parts of him he couldn't, and eventually he whispered that he was terrified the scholarship would fail, that he wasn't strong enough to carry a legacy like Vernon's without breaking it. Mara looked at him with a steady tenderness and told him that legacies don't live in perfect plans or perfect people. They live in intentions that keep growing even when the ground feels shaky. She reminded him that Vernon shaped countless lives just by being present, and now that same presence was touching her life because of Calvin. Something eased in his chest, not disappearing but loosening, like the first breath after holding sorrow too long. But beneath the relief, a deep shadow lingered, an awareness that more truth waited underneath this guilt, truth he hadn't spoken aloud yet. Mara saw it in his eyes, the way they flickered with fear of what might come next, and she reached out, gently brushing his sleeve so he would look at her. She told him he didn't have to carry everything alone, that grief doesn't shrink when hidden, only when shared. Moments like this make people wonder what decision they would make standing in Calvin's place, whether they would keep their guilt buried or let someone see the truth of it. If you had to choose, would you open up or keep the pain inside? Comment what you think, because your voice shapes how stories like this continue to grow. Calvin closed his eyes slowly as her words touched the part of him he had avoided facing. He knew this moment was only the beginning of what he needed to confront, and that the next steps would test everything he had been holding back. He rose to his feet with Mara's help, breathing in a way that felt heavy but clearer, and as he looked around the room filled with Vernon's memory, he sensed the path ahead shifting again. Something was coming, something that would force him to reveal the part of the story he had kept hidden, even from himself. And the decisions he made now would decide how the rest of his life unfolded. The room held its breath with him, waiting for the truth he could no longer outrun. Calvin stayed leaning against the low table for a moment after Mara helped him up, the last tremor of his sobs easing into a heavy quiet that felt different from the silence that crushed him earlier. This one carried something warmer, something that made him breathe a little deeper, even though his chest still ached. Mara stood beside him, not trying to fill the air with words, letting him settle into himself again. He finally whispered that he never meant for her to see him like that, and she shook her head gently, saying, "People don't get to choose their breaking points, only what they do after them." That softened something inside him, and he let out a small breath that almost felt like a release. They moved slowly toward the couch, sitting where the soft light fell across Vernon's photos, and for the first time since she entered his world, Calvin looked at her without any walls. He confessed that he had spent years believing strength meant keeping everything inside, never letting anyone touch parts of him that might make him look weak. Mara listened with her hands together, her eyes steady on him, and she admitted that from the outside, it looked like people with money had everything under control. That loneliness didn't touch them the same way. She said she never imagined a billionaire could feel more alone than she did in her quiet apartment on nights when the world felt heavy. Calvin's voice cracked as he answered that money opens doors but closes hearts when it becomes a shield, and he envied how easily she connected with people, how natural it came to her to care without overthinking what it would cost. Mara smiled softly, telling him she didn't connect easily with everyone, only with people whose pain called out to her in honest ways. She said she saw something quiet in him that night in the diner, something she couldn't just walk past. Calvin lowered his head, letting her words settle, and after a long breath, he admitted that he didn't understand kindness like hers, because most of the caring he received in his world came with hidden expectations. He said he forgot what it felt like to be treated like a person, rather than a name or an opportunity. Mara leaned a little closer, not out of pity but out of recognition, and told him that sometimes people forget their own humanity when everything around them demands more and more of them. She said Vernon probably understood that about him better than anyone else, and maybe that was why he meant so much to Calvin. At the sound of his mentor's name, Calvin's eyes softened again, but this time with something that looked like understanding rather than grief alone. He told her Vernon had once said that the real measure of a life isn't success, but the people who feel safer because you existed. Mara let that settle between them and whispered that maybe Calvin never lost that part of himself, maybe he just forgot how to see it. Times like this make people pause, because emotions shared with honesty tend to connect strangers in quiet ways. Many who listen feel that tug toward understanding someone else's struggles, even if they come from different worlds. It reminds everyone that behind every face there's a story, and somewhere out there others are feeling the same softness, the same pull toward compassion at this exact moment. Calvin breathed in slowly, as if the room itself had shifted with Mara's words. He told her that he didn't bring her into this space for show or for gratitude, but because he felt something in her presence that made him see what he had lost before Vernon passed. Mara lowered her gaze, humbled, saying she never thought anything she did mattered beyond making someone's day a little lighter. She said she didn't realize her small choice to sit with him would follow her all the way into a penthouse filled with the story of a man she never met. Calvin touched one of the framed letters with his fingertips and said she reminded him of the version of himself Vernon once believed he could become. Mara looked at him with a softness that made her own eyes glisten, and she told him that maybe the scholarship wasn't about fixing anything, but about continuing something that never should have ended. Calvin closed his eyes for a moment, letting the idea sink in, letting the weight inside him shift again towards something that wasn't regret, but reflection. The room grew gentler, the air warmer, as if their worlds were no longer standing apart but slowly weaving together in a way that made sense. Calvin felt a strange hope rising in him, quiet but real, like a small light forming after years of darkness. Mara placed a hand on her own heart and said quietly that she believed Vernon would have liked her, not because she was special, but because she understood that kindness is often the only thing people have to offer when life takes more than it gives. Calvin opened his eyes at that and gave her a look filled with gratitude, a look that said he was beginning to understand something deeper about himself through her. Still beneath that warmth, something stirred again in him, a truth he had not yet voiced, a memory tied to Vernon that he had held back even while everything else had spilled out. Mara sensed it, the way his breath shifted, the way his eyes moved toward a closed drawer across the room. She didn't push, but her silence opened a space that almost invited honesty. Calvin felt it too, and he knew that what came next would demand more courage than anything he had shared so far. The last truth about Vernon's final days still waited in the shadows, and facing it might change not only how he saw his mentor, but how he saw himself. Calvin followed Mara's gaze toward the drawer across the room, the one he had been avoiding since the day Vernon passed. The quiet between them grew heavier, but not in a way that pushed them apart. It felt more like the air was holding its breath, waiting for him to take the step he had postponed for months. He walked slowly toward the drawer, each footstep sounding louder than it should, like the apartment itself understood the decision he was about to face. Mara stayed where she was, giving him room without walking away, her presence steady and warm, something he could lean on even from across the room. When he slid the drawer open, his hand paused for a moment in mid-air, shaking just enough for him to notice it, and when his fingers finally touched the packet of letters tied together with an old ribbon, he felt the familiar ache rise in his chest. He carried them back toward the light, sitting beside Mara again as if the room itself needed them to face this together. Calvin untied the ribbon slowly, his breath uneven, and he found the letter he had never opened, the one Vernon wrote in the last week of his life. The envelope had his name in Vernon's careful handwriting, and the sight of it made his eyes sting before he even read a word. He opened it with trembling hands, and as the paper unfolded, the scent of old envelopes and hospital rooms mixed in the air. Vernon's handwriting stretched across the page in careful lines, steady, but showing hints of weakness near the end. Calvin began to read, and the first sentence alone made his breath catch. Vernon wrote that if Calvin was reading this, it meant time had already taken its turn, and he hoped Calvin would forgive him for preparing this conversation on paper instead of in person. Each word pulled Calvin deeper into something he had been trying to ignore, and when he reached the line where Vernon wrote, "Find someone who reminds you of who you were before the money," his whole world seemed to shift. He kept reading, eyes moving slower with every word. Vernon explained that wealth had changed the outside of Calvin's life, but it never changed his core, and sometimes a person needs someone who sees the core before they see the surface. Vernon hoped Calvin would meet someone who carried honesty and presence, someone who didn't treat him like a title, someone who would sit with him in his lowest moments, not out of obligation but out of care. Calvin lowered the letter slightly, letting the truth sink in. Mara felt the shift and waited for him to speak, but he couldn't yet. His mind was racing through memories, not of boardrooms or victories, but of the diner, of Mara sitting quietly, of her choosing kindness without knowing who he was. He lifted the letter again, reading the rest of Vernon's message, where his mentor wrote that he feared Calvin might lose sight of the very thing that made him different from the world he entered, and that finding someone who carried simple humanity could pull him back when he drifted too far from himself. Calvin let out a slow breath, a sound mixed with awe and grief, and something that felt strangely like release. Mara asked softly what the letter said, not wanting to intrude but sensing the weight it carried. Calvin turned toward her, his voice unsteady, and told her that Vernon had hoped he would meet someone like her. She looked at him confused at first, but then her expression softened in disbelief as he read the line aloud, the one asking him to find someone who reminded him of who he was before everything changed. Mara covered her mouth with her hand, her eyes filling with emotion as she realized the depth of what was unfolding around her. She whispered that she didn't know how she could ever be that person, and Calvin told her she already had been without even trying. Not with grand gestures, but with the quiet, steady kind of kindness that touched wounds money couldn't reach. The air in the room seemed to shift again, as if the story that began with a simple moment in a diner was tightening around something larger, hinting that the choices made now would ripple through everything still waiting to unfold. It was the kind of turn that feels small in the moment, but later becomes the point where everything changed for good. Calvin held the letter against his chest for a moment, his eyes closing as if the words were still echoing inside him. He felt something he hadn't felt in a long time, a deep reconciliation with a part of himself he thought he had lost forever. Vernon's message didn't just guide him, it freed him from the guilt that had been eating at him, reminding him that the path forward wasn't about repairing the past, but carrying its lessons forward. Mara watched him slowly steady, watched the fear fade just enough to let clarity come through. She placed her hand lightly on his forearm, telling him that maybe she wasn't the answer to Vernon's letter, but she was willing to walk beside him while he figured it out. Calvin looked at her with a mixture of gratitude and wonder, realizing she had become the grounding presence Vernon hoped he would find. He said softly that she reminded him of himself before money hardened the edges of his life, before success turned into armor. Mara nodded, absorbing the weight of that trust, and said that everyone needs someone who sees them clearly, no matter how high they climb or how far they fall. Calvin looked around the room at the photos and memories and the legacy Vernon left behind, and he felt a new kind of strength rise in him, one that came not from power or wealth, but from truth. The letter had shifted something fundamental inside him, reframed everything he thought about guilt, purpose, and his place in the world. He realized that honoring Vernon wasn't about perfection or grand gestures, but about living the lessons Vernon tried to teach him. He folded the letter carefully and placed it on the table, feeling the weight in his chest slowly transform from pain to understanding. Mara watched him with a quiet smile, sensing that a turning point had arrived. Calvin met her eyes and whispered that now he understood why their paths crossed, why he couldn't shake the feeling that she was meant to be part of this chapter of his life. And as that truth settled between them, the next question rose with a new kind of urgency, clear and unmistakable. How would he honor Vernon's final request in a way that stayed true to both the past and the future waiting just ahead? Calvin held the letter for a long moment after reading Vernon's final words, letting the room steady around him. The air felt warmer, quieter, like something heavy had lifted just enough for him to breathe without breaking. Mara stayed close, not touching him yet, but her presence wrapped around the moment like a soft blanket. When he finally turned toward her, his eyes shimmered with a mixture of fear and courage, and the small motion of his lips pressing together showed he was gathering himself for something deeper than anything he had said before. He took a slow breath, and his voice came out rough as he told her that there was one more truth he had been holding back, something he had never said to anyone. He swallowed hard and confessed that the day she sat with him in the diner, he had been closer to collapsing than he let anyone know. He said he hadn't just been grieving. He had been empty in a way that scared him, a way that made him feel like he was standing on the edge of a cliff, with no one to catch him if he slipped. His face tightened as he admitted that her kindness pulled him back from a kind of darkness he wasn't sure he would have escaped on his own. Mara blinked at him, her breath trembling as she took in the weight of his words. Calvin's voice grew softer when he thanked her, not with the cold formality he was used to, but with the raw sincerity of a man speaking from a place he had never let anyone see. Mara placed her hand over her heart, like she needed to steady it, because no one had ever spoken to her with that kind of honesty before. She opened her mouth and closed it again, struggling to gather her thoughts as her eyes filled with tears. She finally whispered that she didn't save him, that she only did what she hoped someone would have done for her if she ever reached a moment that dark. Calvin shook his head gently, saying that sometimes the smallest gesture can be the bridge between holding on and letting go, and that he hadn't realized how badly he needed someone to sit with him until she did. Mara let out a shaky breath as she moved closer, sitting beside him instead of across from him. Her hands trembled a little as she spoke about nights when she had felt invisible, when her own heart had felt too heavy, and she wished someone would notice without her needing to ask. She admitted she never imagined her small act of compassion would ripple so far, and the realization made her chest tighten in a way she couldn't name. Calvin told her that Vernon had always believed people meet for reasons that reveal themselves over time, and now, looking at her, he understood what his mentor meant. The room seemed to hush around them as they shared these truths, like the walls themselves leaned in to hold the words that had been kept hidden for too long. Calvin's shoulders, usually tense with responsibility, and the image he was expected to carry softened visibly. He said he had spent most of his adult life building armor, so no one could hurt him, and in the process, he forgot what it felt like to let someone in. Mara's voice cracked as she answered that sometimes armor keeps the wrong things out, and that she was glad he let her be there, even when he wasn't ready. Their eyes met, and something passed between them that didn't need any grand label, something made of understanding and a shared ache that turned into connection. The quiet felt different now, not empty, but full of something warm and fragile, like a lantern glowing in the corner of a dark room. Calvin's breath shook when he said he didn't know how to repay her for what she gave him that day, and Mara shook her head again, telling him some things aren't meant to be paid back, only carried forward. She looked at Vernon's letter on the table and said, maybe that was the real meaning of his mentor's final message, that he wanted Calvin to find someone who reminded him of his own heart. Calvin stared at her with a softness he didn't know he was capable of showing, and Mara felt her throat tighten as she realized he wasn't the towering figure she imagined from news stories. He was a man, hurting, healing, learning to breathe again, and she had become part of that without meaning to. The truth of that connection settled over them like a gentle wave, washing away the last barrier between their worlds. Calvin leaned back slightly, wiping the last trace of tears from his cheeks, and for the first time since Vernon passed, he felt a kind of peace taking shape inside him. It wasn't complete and it wasn't perfect, but it was real. Mara dried her own eyes and let herself smile, small but sincere, a smile that told him they had crossed from strangers into something steadier, something that felt like two lives touching in a place where both had been lonely. The weight of what they had shared lingered in the air, but it no longer felt crushing. Instead, it felt like a door opening, a path forming, a moment that marked the point where both of them stopped pretending they were fine and finally let themselves be seen. And as the room grew quiet again, Calvin looked around at Vernon's photos and whispered that maybe, for the first time, he understood what his mentor had been trying to teach him all along. The truth lingered between them like a warm glow, carrying a new question that neither of them fully knew how to answer yet. After a moment like this, after letting the armor fall, what would life look like moving forward? Weeks passed, and the world around Calvin began to shift in small but steady ways, just as something inside him had shifted the day he opened Vernon's last letter. The scholarship launch had been planned carefully, not with the usual glitter and grand speeches that marked events in his industry, but with the quiet sincerity that felt right for the legacy he wanted to honor. The venue was a community hall rather than a luxury hotel, filled with simple lights, folding chairs, and people whose lives had been touched by Vernon's generosity over the years. Mara stood near the stage, adjusting the papers in her hands. Even though she had already read her speech so many times, she could almost hear it without looking. The confidence in her voice had grown over the weeks, shaped by moments that revealed her strength in ways she didn't know she carried. She wore a soft smile that reflected both nerves and pride, her eyes finding Calvin across the room as he gave her an encouraging nod. He wasn't there as the billionaire leading the project, but as someone watching a life he once took for granted bloom again in front of him. When Mara stepped up to the microphone, the room quieted with the ease that comes when people sense they are about to hear something honest. She began talking about small kindnesses, the ones people overlook, the ones that never make headlines but hold people together on difficult days. She spoke about moments when listening mattered more than solving, when presence weighed more than advice. Her voice wavered only once, when she mentioned the stranger who had walked into her diner looking like the world had taken everything from him, and how choosing to sit with him for a few minutes changed more lives than she ever imagined. Calvin watched her closely, the warmth in his chest growing with each sentence. Not because the scholarship was successful, but because he saw her becoming someone Vernon would have admired deeply. She ended her speech by thanking those who showed kindness without expecting anything in return, and when the audience applauded, her smile trembled with emotion. As she stepped away from the podium, Calvin felt his throat tighten with pride, not the showy kind he used to feel when he closed a deal, but the quiet, grounding kind that made his heartbeat feel steady again. After the ceremony, people mingled and shared stories about Vernon, about the new opportunities the fund would bring, about how kindness had shaped their lives. Mara found Calvin near one of the photo displays, his hands in his pockets, looking at an old picture of him and Vernon laughing on a bench outside a small cafe. She approached him, her steps light, and when he turned to face her, their faces mirrored the same soft relief, the kind that comes when something long broken has finally found a place to rest. She told him that the world needed more people who believed in things like this, not in grand movements, but in simple acts that reached people personally. Calvin answered that none of it would have happened without her, that she had reminded him of the part of himself he thought was gone forever. Mara lowered her eyes, touched by his sincerity, saying she only did what her heart told her, and everything that happened afterwards was something she never expected life to give her. They stood there for a moment in comfortable silence, surrounded by photos of a man who had meant so much to Calvin, and who, in a way she never saw coming, had become part of her story too. As the event wound down, people began to leave in warm clusters of conversation, their voices soft with meaning. Calvin and Mara walked toward the exit together, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows on the ground. At the door they paused, not because they didn't know what to say next, but because they both felt the weight of a chapter coming to a close in the gentlest way. Calvin thanked her again, but this time with a steady voice, telling her he didn't just appreciate what she did for him that day in the diner, he admired who she was every day after. Mara smiled with a quiet glow, saying she saw him now not as the man wealth made him appear to be, but as the one Vernon had believed in from the beginning. They parted with a soft nod, not needing anything more dramatic because something far more important had settled between them, the understanding that compassion had changed them both, not into new people, but into truer versions of themselves. In the weeks that followed, the scholarship gained attention for all the right reasons. People wrote letters about how small acts of kindness had shaped their own lives, and Mara answered many of them personally, believing that connection was the heart of the project. Calvin visited the memorial room often, but now he entered with a sense of peace rather than grief. He would look at Vernon's photos and feel gratitude instead of regret, knowing he was finally honoring the lessons that shaped him. Sometimes he found himself thinking back to the diner, remembering the exact moment Mara chose to sit with him, unaware that her simple choice would ripple into so many lives. And each time he smiled, not with sadness, but with a quiet triumph, because he finally understood that the greatest legacies don't come from wealth or achievements, but from presence, from the willingness to sit beside someone when their world is falling apart and simply be there. On a quiet evening, while closing his apartment windows against the soft breeze, Calvin whispered a small thank you to Vernon for guiding him even in absence. Then he whispered another thank you, this one for Mara, for showing him how deep kindness could reach. The story no longer felt like a wound. It felt like a bridge across time and grief, shaped by the choices they made, shaped by the moment one person chose to see someone who was hurting. And as life moved forward with its quiet rhythm, both Calvin and Mara carried that truth with them. Compassion doesn't end when the moment passes. It continues in every life it touches. Before this story closes, pause for a moment and think about this ending. Would you have the courage to sit with someone who looked broken, the way Mara did? What part of Calvin's journey reminded you of someone in your own life? And most of all, how many lives do you think could change if more people slowed down long enough to notice someone else's pain? Share your answer in the comments. Your voice brings these stories to life. Thank you for staying with me until the end of this journey. Write your first and last name in the comments so I know you completed the whole story. And if this touched your heart, leave a like and subscribe to the channel so new stories like this can keep coming every week. If this tale moved you because kindness transformed everything, the next video will shake you even more. It follows a family secret revealed in the most unexpected place, and the truth inside it changes their lives forever. Click on the next story and keep the emotion going.